I want to do a video today in response to a video you might have seen yesterday where Trump was at the White House and he was talking about his Afghanistan strategy, among other issues. And in the Q&A, Trump ended up sort of going on a detour, and he remarked in passing, he said, quote, "The reason Russia was in Afghanistan was because terrorists were going into Russia. They were right to be there." So Trump was talking here about actually not the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, but the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. And he was basically citing the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, which he attributed as being one of the factors in why the Soviet Union ultimately fell apart, to draw parallels to the U.S. experience and engagement in Afghanistan. And what he was basically arguing was that it's an area that where the U.S. ought to tread lightly. Now, I want to talk here about, first of all, I mean, I would recommend that you actually go and watch the video from Trump. I mean, I'm going to try to do a serious dive into his remarks here, but when you hear the guy talk, I mean, the thing I was reminded of, frankly, was the last time I went to a bowling alley, it was probably like 10 or 15 years ago, and there's always like an older drunk uncle at the bar talking about politics, and that was sort of the flair of how Trump was talking about it. But for better or worse, he's the president, and I think that when he opines even in a casual way on history, I think this is worth engaging and thinking about. I also think, too, incidentally, and this is a debate among historians that Neil Ferguson and others have weighed into on the value of actual history, to think through different scenarios and things that could have been. Newt Gingrich actually is another popular historian who's done this, and I think it's an immensely valuable way of trying to understand different events. But so I want to, anyway, do a deeper dive into really two issues here. One, why did the Soviet Union invade Afghanistan? And then two, were they right to be there? And hopefully this will be informative both as a historical matter and also to inform our current debate about our engagement in Afghanistan. Now, okay, the reason Russia was in Afghanistan was because terrorists were going into Russia. First of all, I think this is actually an area of Soviet studies and whatnot that actually hasn't been quite explored. This isn't my expertise, but one of the things to recognize that the Soviet Union, in many ways, was actually a Russian empire. The Russian state had been engaged in imperialistic drives and continues to be. And the Soviet Union was really, in some ways, a maximal point of the Russian empire, where the Soviet Union was, in fact, a Russian empire comprised not only of the country of Russia, but also many independent states and countries that had been independent before, one of which were the Central Asian states that were largely Muslim. And the Soviets were constantly paranoid about the risk of Muslim separatism in these Central Asian states. And they were constantly dealing with insurgent attacks from these Muslim areas. And I think that there's still a lot of work to be done to precisely figure out what happened. But Soviet fears did materialize ultimately with the breakup of the Soviet Union, not only because of what happened in Afghanistan, but also from the separatist movement in Central Asia, which actually remain a factor in Russian thinking today. But in terms of, was Russia in Afghanistan because terrorists were going into Russia? And I think that is largely untrue, at least at the outset. But it becomes true later on for reasons I'll talk about. So I think it's important to lay the groundwork for what happened and what was happening in Afghanistan that really culminated in the Soviet invasion in 1979. So in 1963, there was a very important thing that happened in Afghanistan, which is that Zahir Shah consolidated power in Afghanistan. And he was basically a young monarch. He was known to be a passive, kind of a weak leader. But upon taking power, he actually ended up being one of the most transformative and leaders that Afghanistan would have, where he basically announced that he would now reverse many of the country's authoritarian trends, and he would try to put Afghanistan on a path to Western-style democracy. And this was a very risky gambit for Zahir Shah, not only because he was a young monarch with a unclear command on the Afghan government, but the last Afghan leader who had tried to modernize the country on the basis of Western models was someone by the name of Amanullah Khan. And he was basically forced out of the country in 1929 due to a backlash from Afghanistan's more conservative elements, many of which obviously were Islamists. Zahir Shah, he had this record of equivocation and inaction, as a historian called it, but he really dove into this modernization project. Now, one of the areas where it's really manifest was in Afghanistan's fledgling higher education area, and this was an area that the U.S. and U.S. development agencies actually were eager to partner with Afghanistan on as part of their global effort in the Cold War to compete in universities and try to lay the ideological framework for promoting American values, Western values in these areas that were not necessarily receptive. And so what you had at Kabul University and other areas was a new generation of reformers, often inspired, if not directly backed by the U.S. and its allies. And they were basically trying to create a liberal ideological antidote to basically competing forces in Afghanistan. And what the king hoped, what Zahir Shah hoped, was that in particular higher education, he hoped that the universities would play a role in basically inspiring a nationalist ideology in Afghanistan, which over time would relegate the emphasis on Islamic studies that were at that point a central tenet of Afghan education. And so, for example, at the time, in the 1956 issue of the Yale Review, you had a journalist write that quote, the Afghan royal family realizes that the immediate problem is to give the educated minority a larger share in decision-making at all levels, lest they start looking north to communist Russia or south to Republican India and Pakistan for political inspiration. And, and then later, another historian here, her name is Ruzba Shirazai, and she writes about pre-1970 initiatives in Afghanistan, and she writes, the United States was concerned with Islam as a social force in the Middle East long before the rise of political Islam that presently characterizes much of the Middle East, and that the United States sought to harmonize Western thought with Islam in order to promote economic development and social change. Islam was viewed as a regressive force by most of the ruling Afghan elites and their foreign educational consultants, whereas clerical and tribal forces remained suspicious and hostile to the efforts of the Afghan state to create a new educational system. So, today, if you talk to Afghans and Afghan elites and so forth, they really regard this period that Zahir Shah was reigning as the so-called constitutional period, or the golden era of Afghanistan. Now things began to change, unfortunately for Afghanistan, in the 1960s and 70s, where the U.S. and its allies basically decided that they were going to detect with the Soviet Union. They were obviously reeling from problems in Vietnam, among other places. And so they thought that one way to pursue détente with the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan, where they would basically say, look, Afghanistan is not where we want to be engaging, spending our resources, really taking the fight to the Soviets. So they ended up reducing their aid. The U.S. ended up reducing its aid to Afghanistan, and obviously the people who really ended up being hurt by this U.S. withdrawal were the people, these reformers who were sort of advocating for Western liberal norms in the universities. So these were the obviously the monarchical religious elite, the monarchical secular elite, but also they were religious reformists, and nationalists, all people who were, for various reasons, looking for an ally in the West. And the U.S. retreat from Afghanistan really fueled an identity crisis among Afghan elites, principally, but also these other factions in Afghanistan. And basically, what ended up happening is they began to see communism in a more favorable light. So I want to quote here. This is a very nice paragraph here by a scholar of the period, Asta Olason. And it really captures the disillusionment that Afghanistan's educated class began to feel amid this U.S. withdrawal, and why they began to embrace leftist ideologies. So she writes here, this new social class was left stranded between the westernized elite and their own traditional rural background. Their education had alienated them from their university and given them a veneer of westernization, but without securing them a social and economic position according to their wishes. Most were obliged to accept poorly paid administrative positions in rural outposts or teaching jobs in village schools. Here, more often than not, they would feel themselves to be a stranger in relation to the local community, feeling intellectually apart from and above the rural scene, while resenting or envying the power and privileges of the local notables, and using all their efforts to try to get a posting in one of the major cities, preferably Kabul. From the 1960s, these features of alienation, unsatisfied aspirations, and frustrated ambitions were combined with a rising social and political awareness, producing a growing resentment and hostility to the impotence of the democratic institutions and what was seen as the abuse and corruption of the ruling establishment. The rejection of the existing social order was combined with a wish to influence or take power and redirect social development to create justice and equality. The more this goal appeared, the more radical the solutions became. And then she also makes note that many of these students came from a traditional religious background where Islam was mixed up with local customs, superstition, and worship of holy men. These values were questioned, at times rejected in toto, and many young people instead turned to atheism and communism with blind fervor and conviction in these established dogmas, rather than as a result of reflection and knowledge. So the Soviets now recognize an opportunity. The U.S. is withdrawing from Afghanistan. They're on the defensive globally. The Soviets appear to be, they have their problems internally, but now they begin to see a real opportunity here in Afghanistan. And so they really begin to infiltrate Afghan society at all levels, but this really manifests in the higher education sphere. So what ended up happening for Afghanistan educational institutions, basically on their teaching Russian language courses, and they also subsidized the cost of thousands of Afghan students to come and attend schools in the Eastern Bloc. And so by 1975, you had as many as 40,000 civilian students of all ages who were studying in in the Soviet Union. And there were actually more Afghan students at this point in the Soviet Union than any country, with the possible exception of Vietnam. And then, obviously these Afghans who were educated in the Eastern Bloc were rewarded with prestigious positions when they returned to Afghanistan. And so basically, I mean, this was a Soviet project that really was quite remarkable and effective. And you had all the way from the universities down to school teachers, people who were sort of learning Russian, inculcated with communist ideology and Soviet nation, but they were also now becoming a new educated elite who had respectable employment and responsibility in politics. Now, the problem for the Soviets here is that their exercise in state and nation building is going well from the standpoint of their competition with the U.S. and the Western Bloc, and the competition with liberal democracy generally. But the problem is that there is also now a countervailing current that's growing during this period as well, which is Islamism. So basically what you end up seeing is that in addition to as the U.S. is retreating, as liberals are on the defensive, you have at the same time Sunni Islamist factions that are emerging on Afghan campuses, and really trying to sort of be campus politics at Kabul University and so forth in the late 60s, early 70s. Now, many of the Islamist faculty members who by now are making their way into Afghanistan, many of these were faculty members who were educated in Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and they were influenced there by the fundamentalist ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. And so by the early 1970s, about half of the theology department at Kabul University was comprised of Al-Azhar alumni, these Muslim Brotherhood types from the University of Cairo. And so obviously these Islamists, as they're seeing Soviet-backed communist parties really infiltrating Afghan society, they're growing concerned for their own reasons. And so you have these Islamist movements now reaching out to Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Muslim networks throughout the Sunni world. And now they begin their own effort to fill the void here and compete now, basically to finish up the job of removing these liberals from Afghanistan, and now waging competition with this growing communist threat. And so this is when you begin to see the launch of the Afghan branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. That in turn ends up spawning new Islamist parties, notably the Hizb-e-Islami, which is which will mean something to scholars of this period. So what ends up happening is basically that you can actually see footage of this period. It's quite interesting, where you have both you have Islamists now burning American flags, and they're doing so basically to demonstrate their independence from both the communist and the Western worlds. Now, all of this now is basically creating a volatile atmosphere, and so Steve Cole writes in his account of the period. He basically says, with virtually little competition from liberals, moderates, technocrats, a new generation of Islamist leaders are really the ones now taking up the anti-communist struggle in Afghanistan. And so Cole writes, quote, every university student now is confronted with a choice: communism or radical Islam. In the space of just a few years during the late 1960s and early 1970s, what little there was of the center in Afghan politics melted away in Kabul under the friction of these confrontational imported ideologies. And by the 70s, Kabul University was now basically the center of insurgents. Now, all of these tensions in Afghan society really come to head in 1978, or 1978, Sword Revolution. Here, and what are called the Khalqis seize power, and the Khalqis are basically sort of fellow travelers of the Soviet Union, and they basically view Soviet indoctrination, communist indoctrination, as being a shortcut to social revolution, and they begin to place a great deal of emphasis on Marxist dogma, Russian language courses. They go and purge technocrats and academics throughout Afghan society. They either kill them or re-educate them. So basically now what you have with this Khalq revolution, you have Soviet citizens, Communist Party officials, many from these Central Asian republics, and they're basically now just infiltrating Afghan society. And so 1970 invasion, and we'll get to that, you had basically Soviet advisors, Communist Party bureaucrats who had basically seized control of Afghanistan's major ministries and institutions. Now, the problem is that as effective as the Soviets are here, they don't really have a handle on this Islamist section or Islamist problem in Afghanistan, and so what ends up happening is they end up seeing that basically by the late 70s there's this opportunity here that this revolution has happened in Afghanistan, which really has the potential of potentially basically adding a new element, a new country, a new sphere into the Soviet bloc, but it's now under a significant challenge and threat from Islamist forces. And so the Soviet Union now is faced with a dilemma here, where they have a choice now. I mean, basically they can either watch the 1978 coup fail, and then they now can either watch defeat happen on their borders, or they can invade Afghanistan to basically save the revolution and consolidate it. There's just an important side note worth mentioning, that when the 78 revolution happened in Afghanistan, if you go back and look at the American writing on the period, what you find is basically that the American elites, American scholars, really had no clue what was going on. So you had, for example, Louis Dupree, for example, he was a preeminent authority on Afghanistan at the time in the U.S. He's basically saying, look, these guys who orchestrated the coup in 1978, they're not communists. They're not really Soviet backers. They're more these agrarian, these like rural people with their own agenda, or so you have like a Washington Post op-ed from the period describing the people who took over in 78 as being, quote, agrarian reformers, intentionally nationalistic, and likely to be formidably opposed to direct Soviet intervention. I mean, this is just totally wrong, total nonsense. I mean, this was very much a proxy of the Soviets. Now, okay, so the Soviet Union intervenes. They invade Afghanistan in 1979. And what I would argue is what ends up happening here is that, this goes now to what I think Trump was alluding to or talking about, which is that an invasion was very much orchestrated and created and done for in order to basically consolidate a communist revolution and consolidate their support in Afghanistan. As the Soviet-Afghan War continues through the 80s, it increasingly becomes more and more a project to really take on what I would call Islamist terrorism. I mean, at the time it was referred to more generously as insurgents, freedom fighters, etc. But these were, as we found out the hard way, I mean, these were terrorist groups. I mean, who were basically, yes, sort of trying to get freedom and autonomy for their country, but they also had a broader agenda, and they were certainly not fighting with what anyone would call the laws of war. What ends up happening now, 4 years into the Soviet-Afghan invasion, is the Union basically very fractured, very divided. There's a very wide span of different ideologies and agendas. There's the monarchists, the nationalists, but there's also that there are all kinds of different ethnic groups with their own agendas. But the Islamists now are really coming to the fore, taking the lead. And so in 1983, Ahmed Shah Massoud, who was a major figure in the Afghan resistance, he declared a truce with the Soviets. And what ended up happening now is that the top Mujahideen client of Pakistan's ISI is a guy named Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And it's very interesting now that the Soviets recognize that these mujahideen, these Islamist fighters, really are the most now especially that they're backed by Pakistan, by Saudi Arabia, by the Sunni world, are emerging as the most formidable obstacle to their occupation. So you see, for example, that when you look at Soviet propaganda from this period, they describe Hekmatyar, yes, as a, quote, bloodthirsty mercenary of U.S. imperialism, but they also go to great lengths to mock his Islamist pretenses. So, like, I found when I was researching this period, there was a profile of Hekmatyar in the Soviet propaganda magazine TASS, and they basically describe Hekmatyar. They talk about how he used to own a firm in Kabul that dealt with selling and buying Western-made cars. When the government of the people was established in Afghanistan, Hekmatyar fled the country. Now he is wrathful and hopes to turn back the history of Afghanistan and return to the golden era when he was plundering Afghanistan along with capital, and when he was receiving large amounts of money from foreigners. The so-called defender of pure Islam, who presents himself as such, in the past was well known in Kabul for sensualism, lust, and pleasure-seeking. So what they're basically saying is, look, Hekmatyar is he's branding himself as a defender of Islam, but he's actually a fraud. He's really a crony capitalist aligned with the West. But Hekmatyar was actually serious, whatever his background, that he had basically now emerged as this Islamist leader. He's now leading this Islamist insurgency, and he's openly now announcing that once the Soviets are gone, they're going to try to install a caliph in a new Islamic regime in Kabul to replace what the Soviet government that was or Soviet-backed government that was currently there. Now, where it gets complicated here is that the Soviet invasion, which began as a sort of aggressive imperialistic drive to impose communism, impose Soviet rule, it becomes obviously harder, bloodier, far more difficult than what Soviet strategists were anticipating, and this effort begins really to become a project in state and nation building, where the Soviets realize that sure, they can bomb Afghan society to hell, they can wage a ruthless military campaign, but if they want to ultimately establish an ensconce government in Afghanistan that can actually rule and govern and turn Afghanistan into a reliable satellite of the Soviet Empire, they're going to have to build institutions in Afghanistan. They're going to have to sort of lay down some kind of rules. And during this period in the 80s when the war is happening, the Soviet Union makes a big investment in Afghan education, and they make particular allowances for women, for national minorities. They give scholarships for high-achieving women. So, by 1985, 65% of Kabul University students were actually women. And then 3 years later, in 1988, the university had more than 7,000 female students, 90 female professors. They were supporting a nationalities program. They were promoting sort of the Uzbek language. They had you basically, and what ended up happening was that these efforts, whatever their motivation, they ended up yielding significant gains in Afghan higher education. So the United Nations, for example, did a report in 1989, and they note that in the 1977 through 1978 school year, total enrollment in Afghanistan higher education was only 7,000, and a decade later, through this period of the Soviet-Afghan War, due largely to Soviet efforts, you had now 7 higher education institutions in Afghanistan. There were more than 15,000 students there. And you also had reforms happening too, that like there were more academic positions, department heads that were basically now being elected and free and secret ballots. So there is a sort of qualitative change in the way Afghanistan was, or sorry, with the way now the Soviets are dealing with Afghanistan. And there is now becoming more and more of an argument that maybe the Soviets here are embarking on something that's simply an imperialistic effort, that they're actually now undertaking an effort that has sort of a certain defensible nature here. Now, this issue of, Trump says here, okay, the Soviets were right to be there. Now, this question, or this issue of the extent to which the Soviet presence in Afghanistan was legitimate was actually an issue that was a source of real debate within the U.S. really throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s, into the early 90s, and initially there was a certain fatalism that had set in, where basically Americans were resigned to the idea that maybe Afghanistan would be in a state of what was termed at the time Soviet tilted neutralism. What they basically were arguing, the Americans who were in favor of detente with the Soviet Union, they were basically saying, look, it's only natural for countries that are close to a superpower to accommodate it. It's not really worth it for the U.S. to get involved in this Afghan struggle. Afghanistan could become an example of Soviet tilted neutralism. If the Soviets wanted to keep Afghanistan, so be it. Now, over time, especially when the Reagan administration came in, they began to view the Afghan struggle in a different light, as really an example of where you could have an indigenous revolution taking on Soviet presence. And so, using proxies in Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, they began to really make an aggressive drive to use proxies to drive out the Soviet Union. But by the middle of the 1980s now, it becomes clear that the Soviets are really down in Afghanistan. It's just becoming an enormously costly endeavor for the Soviets, and they're now the Soviets themselves are talking about withdrawing. Gorbachev famously called Afghanistan a bleeding wound. So beginning really in the mid 80s now, you now begin to have the U.S. government thinking through, well, the Soviets are now saying they want to withdraw. We don't know if they're telling the truth. What's going to happen now? What is a legitimate role for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan? How should we think about this? So there are these whole very, very complicated technical debates and discussions about precisely how much backing or legitimacy the communist regime in Kabul should have. Should the Soviets be allowed to back the government? What U.S. obligations to the Soviet government? Should the American goal be to completely drive out Soviet presence altogether? Basically what Reagan ended up deciding was that, look, the Soviets are desperate to leave Afghanistan. We don't need to give them a victory here. We don't need to acquiesce to a communist government in Kabul. So basically what they say is, both, we're going to continue to back the Afghan factions, the Afghan resistance. We're going to try to drive out the Soviets. Now, what ends up happening basically is that much to the surprise and shock of American policymakers and the world, the Soviets actually become serious about withdrawing. And so again, you have a new debate now happening in the U.S. It's really a live question. What happens after the Soviets leave? What comes to pass in Afghanistan? What is this new government? And there's another debate now, again, which goes to the heart of this question of whether or not the Soviet presence in Afghanistan was right, as Trump said, was it legitimate? And the debate basically is, should the U.S. and the Soviets now, should they work together to try to get a new interim government in Afghanistan? Should they try to reach an agreement where you have a government that both the Soviets and the U.S. can live with? And there's basically a debate that happens within the government where one side argues that, look, during the Soviet-Afghan War, the U.S. and Russia and the Soviet Union had a conflict of interest. They had different competing aims, but now that the Red Army is withdrawing, it's defeated, there is some commonality here for the U.S. and Soviet Union to stabilize Afghanistan, to make sure that these Mujahideen guys who are really out of control Islamists by now, to make sure that they don't take over the country, hijack the country, and turn it into a Islamist project. And basically the argument now is that the Soviets, whatever their initial imperialistic aims, it's now a very different Soviet Union, a different set of circumstances. They may have a legitimate reason for having a settlement. But the other argument was that, look, the Soviet Union remains a major threat to the U.S. It remains a major communist power. The Soviets now really are on the brink of a major defeat in Afghanistan. The U.S. had these Afghan resistance, these Mujahideen guys, whatever their Islamist agenda, they had fought loyally and hard, in a hard way to take on the Soviets. They had formed a partnership with the U.S. The relationship with Pakistan and Saudi Arabia had also been strengthened, that we should continue to play this hand, continue to stick with the Mujahideen, and really drive out the communists, drive out the Soviets. Basically, this debate ends up getting resolved in the U.S. government, where basically, the idea is that, look, the Soviets have proxies not only in Afghanistan, but really all over Cold War hotspots, everywhere from Mozambique, Angola, Cambodia, the Horn of Africa. So Afghanistan is really part of this broader issue of Soviet imperialism. It is not legitimate, and that the U.S. really should make a full drive to get rid of this Soviet presence, communist presence in Afghanistan. And this policy basically carries the day, and U.S. guys not only withdraw from Afghanistan, but they also end up losing their empire, and they dissolve. And what at the time appeared to be a victory, I think, with the passage of time, has become much more of a difficult issue, a difficult dilemma, because what appeared to be a very destructive campaign that the Soviets waged, in retrospect, I think one has to concede that whatever damage the Soviets did, however they inflamed the situation, when you look at what happened to Afghanistan in the 90s, what these Islamists, what these terrorists, as Trump would call them, did in Afghanistan was immeasurably worse for the country, for the people of the country, and ultimately for the rest of the world. And the U.S. obviously dealt with that in the form of the 9/11 attacks, and now we're here in Afghanistan all these years later, basically trying to, in some ways, in a very loose sense, do what the Soviets were trying to do, which is to build a government, institutions, a society in its own flavor. So, to answer, Trump's question here, were the Russians in Afghanistan because of a terrorist threat emerging in Afghanistan? And I would argue that while it wasn't the original impetus, really, or the drive, that it was part of the calculus. And as the Soviet invasion carried on, it did become to some degree a counterterrorism effort, a counter-Islamist effort, and one that had some legitimacy. And the question, were they right to be there? Well, should they have invaded at the outset? Probably not. But at a certain point, did they have a legitimate basis to be there in a context where the country has become more and more Islamicized, there is a growing terrorist insurgency threat. There is a real a possibility here of Afghanistan becoming a hotbed of terrorism, extremism, violence, and chaos. Maybe. My general view is that although the U.S. and the Soviet Union both made any number of really catastrophic mistakes, at the end of the day, really securing and consolidating the defeat of the Soviet Union was probably worth the price of what happened in Afghanistan. But I do think that there's a legitimate counterfactual debate, a legitimate question here of, precisely what right, what legitimacy did the Soviet Union have to be in Afghanistan? And I think that there's a reasonable historical discussion to be had, looking at the counterfactual, where maybe if the Soviets had remained in Afghanistan, maybe if the U.S. hadn't and the Mujahideen hadn't driven them out, were there a set of areas that could be better? I don't know.